Chapter 50. Hunting for Answers. This way, snapped the bald man. He stepped back, keeping the dagger pressed under Murtag's chin, then wheeled to the right, disappearing through an arched doorway. The warriors cautiously followed him, their attention centered on Eragon and Saphira. The horses were led into a different tunnel. Dazed by the turn of events, Eragon started after Murtag. He glanced at Saphira to confirm that Arya was still tied to her back. She has to get the antidote, he thought frantically, knowing that even then the Skilna brag was fulfilling its deadly purpose within her flesh. He hurried through the arched doorway down a narrow corridor after the bald man. The warriors kept their weapons pointed at him. They swept past the sculpture of a peculiar animal with thick quills. The corridor curved sharply to the left, then to the right. A door opened and they entered a bare room large enough for Saphira to move around with ease. There was a hollow boom as the door closed, followed by a loud scrape as the bolt was secured on the outside. Eragon slowly examined his surroundings, Zarok tight in his hand. The walls, floor, and ceiling were made of polished white marble that reflected a ghost image of everyone, like a mirror of veined milk. One of the unusual lanterns hung in each corner. "There's an injured," he began, but the sharp gesture from the bald man cut him off. "Do not speak. It must wait until you have been tested." He shoved Murtag over to one of the warriors, who pressed a sword against Murtag's neck. Bald man clasped his hands together softly. "Remove your weapons and slide them to me." A dwarf unbuckled Murtag's sword and dropped it on the floor with a clank. Loath to be parted with Zarok, Eragon unfastened the sheath and set it and the blade on the floor. He placed his bow and quiver next to them, then pushed the pile towards the warriors. "Now step away from your dragon and slowly approach me," commanded the bald man. Puzzled, Eragon moved forward. When they were a yard apart, the man said, "Stop there. Now remove the defenses from around your mind and prepare to let me inspect your thoughts and memories. If you try to hide anything from me, I will take what I want by force, which would drive you mad. If you don't submit, your companion will be killed." "Why?" asked Eragon, aghast. "To be sure you aren't in Galbatorix's service, and to understand why hundreds of Urgals are banging on our front door," growled the bald man. His close-set eyes shifted from point to point with cunning speed. "No one may enter Fathendur without being tested." "There isn't time. We need a healer," protested Eragon. "Silence!" roared the man, pressing down his robe with thin fingers. "Until you are examined, your words are meaningless." "But she's dying," retorted Eragon angrily, pointing at Arya. They were in a precarious position, but he would let nothing else happen until Arya was cared for. "It will have to wait. No one will leave this room until we have discovered the truth of this matter. Unless you wish." The dwarf who had saved Eragon from the lake jumped forward. "Are you blind, Igraz Khan? Can't you see that's an elf on the dragon? We cannot keep her here if she's in danger. Ajihad and the king will have our heads if she's allowed to die." The man's eyes tightened with anger. After a moment he relaxed and said smoothly, "Of course, Auric. We wouldn't want that to happen." He snapped his fingers and pointed at Arya. "Remove her from the dragon." The two human warriors sheathed their swords and hesitantly approached Saphira, who watched them steadily. "Quickly, quickly!" The men unstrapped Arya from the saddle and lowered the elf to the floor. One of the men inspected her face, then said sharply, "It's the dragon egg courier! Arya!" "What?" exclaimed the bald man. The dwarf Auric's eyes widened with astonishment. The bald man fixed his steely gaze on Eragon and said flatly, "You have much explaining to do." Eragon returned the intense stare with all the determination he could muster. She was poisoned with the Skilna brag while in prison. Only Tunavor's nectar can save her now. The bald man's face became inscrutable. He stood motionless, except for his lips, which twitched occasionally. "Very well, take her to the healers and tell them what she needs. Guard her until the ceremony is completed. I will have new orders for you by then." The warriors nodded curtly and carried Arya out of the room. Eragon watched them go, wishing that he could accompany her. His attention snapped back to the bald man as he said, "Enough of this. We have wasted too much time already. Prepare to be examined." Eragon did not want this hairless, threatening man inside his mind, laying bare his every thought and feeling, but he knew that resistance would be useless. The air was strained. Murtag's gaze burned into his forehead. Finally he bowed his head. "I am ready." "Good. Then," he was interrupted as Auric said abruptly, "You'd better not harm him, Ergraz Khan, else the king will have words for you." The bald man looked at him irritably, then faced Eragon with a small smile. "Only if he resists?" He bowed his head and chanted several inaudible words. Eragon gasped with pain and shock as a mental probe clawed its way into his mind. His eyes rolled up into his head and he automatically began throwing up barriers around his consciousness. The attack was incredibly powerful. "Don't do that," cried Saphira. Her thoughts joined his, filling him with strength. "You're putting Murtagh at risk." Eragon faltered, gritted his teeth, then forced himself to remove his shielding, exposing himself to the ravening probe. Disappointment emanated from the bald man. His battering intensified. The force coming from his mind felt decayed and unwholesome. There was something profoundly wrong about it. "He wants me to fight him," cried Eragon as a fresh wave of pain racked him. A second later, it subsided, only to be replaced by another. Saphira did her best to suppress it, but even she could not block it entirely. "Give him what he wants," she said quickly, "but protect everything else. I'll help you. His strength is no match for mine. I'm already shielding our words from him." "Then why does it still hurt?" "The pain comes from you." Eragon winced as the probe dug in farther, hunting for information, like a nail being driven through his skull. Bald Man roughly seized his childhood memories and began sifting through them. "He doesn't need those. Get him out of there," growled Eragon angrily. "I can't, not without endangering you," said Saphira. "I can conceal things from his view, but it must be done before he reaches them. Think quickly and tell me what you want hidden." Eragon tried to concentrate through the pain. He raced through his memories, starting from when he had found Saphira's egg. He hid sections of his discussions with Brom, including all the ancient words he had been taught. Their travels through Palankar Valley, Yazuak, Darret, and Tiem he left mostly untouched. But he had Saphira conceal everything he remembered of Angela's fortune-telling and Selembum. He skipped from their burglary at Tiem to Brom's death, to his imprisonment in Gilead, and lastly to Murtagh's revelation of his true identity. Eragon wanted to hide that as well, but Saphira balked. "The Varden have a right to know who they shelter under their roof, especially if it's a son of the Forsworn." "Just do it," he said tightly, fighting another wave of agony. "I won't be the one to unmask him, at least not to this man." "It'll be discovered as soon as Murtagh is scanned," warned Saphira sharply. "Just do it." With the most important information hidden, there was nothing else for Eragon to do but wait for the bald man to finish his inspection. It was like sitting still while his fingernails were extracted with rusty tongs. His entire body was rigid, jaw locked tightly. Heat radiated from his skin and a line of sweat rolled down his neck. He was acutely aware of each second as the long minutes crept by. The bald man wound through his experiences sluggishly, like a thorny vine pushing its way toward the sunlight. He paid keen attention to many things Eragon considered irrelevant, such as his mother, Selena, and seemed to linger on purpose so as to prolong the suffering. He spent a long time examining Eragon's recollections of the Razak, and then later the Shade. It was not until his adventures had been exhaustively analysed that the bald man began to withdraw from Eragon's mind. The probe was extracted like a splinter being removed. Eragon shuddered, swayed, then fell to the floor. Strong arms caught him at the last second, lowering him to the cool marble. He heard Auric exclaim from behind him, "You went too far. He wasn't strong enough for this." "He'll live. That's all that is needed," answered the bald man curtly. There was an angry grunt. "What did you find?" Silence. "Well, is he to be trusted or not?" The words came reluctantly. "He is not your enemy." There were audible sighs of relief throughout the room. Eragon's eyes fluttered open. He gingerly pushed himself upright. "Easy now," said Auric, wrapping a thick arm around him and helping him to his feet. Eragon wove unsteadily, glaring at the bald man. A low growl rumbled in Saphira's throat. The bald man ignored them. He turned to Murtagh, who was still being held at sword point. "It's your turn now." Murtagh stiffened and shook his head. The sword cut his neck slightly. Blood dripped down his skin. "No. You will not be protected here if you refuse. Eragon has been declared trustworthy, so you cannot threaten to kill him to influence me. Since you can't do that, nothing you say or do will convince me to open my mind." Sneering, the bald man cocked what would have been an eyebrow if he had any. "What of your own life? I can still threaten that." "It won't do any good," said Murtagh stonily and with such conviction that it was impossible to doubt his word. The bald man's breath exploded angrily. "You don't have a choice." He stepped forward and placed a palm on Murtagh's brow, clenching his hand to hold him in place. Murtagh stiffened, face growing as hard as iron, fists clenched, neck muscles bulging. He was obviously fighting the attack with all his strength. The bald man bared his teeth with fury and frustration at the resistance. His fingers dug mercilessly into Murtagh. Eragon winced with sympathy, knowing the battle that raged between them. Can't you help him? He asked Saphira. No, she said softly. He will allow no one into his mind. Oryx scowled darkly as he watched the combatants. Ilf Karns Oroldum, he muttered, then leapt forward and cried, That is enough! He grabbed the bald man's arm and tore him away from Murtagh with strength disproportional to his size. The bald man stumbled back, then turned on Oryx furiously. How dare you? He shouted. You questioned my leadership, opened the gates without permission, and now this? You've shown nothing but insolence and treachery. Do you think your king will protect you now? Oryx bristled. You would have let them die. If I had waited any longer, the Urgles would have killed them. He pointed at Murtagh, whose breath came in great heaves. We don't have any right to torture him for information. Ajihad won't sanction it, not after you've examined the rider and found him free of fault. And they've brought us Arya. Would you allow him to enter unchallenged? Are you so great a fool as to put us all at risk? Demanded the bald man. His eyes were feral with loosely chained rage. He looked ready to tear the dwarf into pieces. Can he use magic? That is, can he use magic? Roared Oryx, his deep voice echoing in the room. The bald man's face suddenly grew expressionless. He clasped his hands behind his back. No. Then what do you fear? It's impossible for him to escape, and he can't work any devilry with all of us here, especially if your powers are as great as you say. But don't listen to me. Ask Ajihad what he wants done. The bald man stared at Oryx for a moment, his face indecipherable, then looked at the ceiling and closed his eyes. A peculiar stiffness set into his shoulders, while his lips moved soundlessly. An intense frown wrinkled on the pale skin above his eyes, and his fingers clenched, as if they were throttling an invisible enemy. For several minutes he stood thus, wrapped in silent communication. When his eyes opened, he ignored Oryx and snapped at the warriors. Leave, now! As they filed through the doorway, he addressed Eragon coldly. Because I was unable to complete my examination, you and your friend will remain here for the night. He will be killed if he attempts to leave. With those words, he turned on his heel and stalked out of the room, pale scalp gleaming in the lantern light. Thank you, whispered Eragon to Oryx. The dwarf grunted. I'll make sure some food is brought. He muttered a string of words under his breath, then left, shaking his head. The bolt was secured once again on the outside of the door. Eragon sat, feeling strangely dreamy from the day's excitement and their forced march. His eyelids were heavy. Saphira settled next to him. We must be careful. It seems we have as many enemies here as we did in the Empire. He nodded, too tired to talk. Murtagh, eyes glazed and empty, leaned against the far wall and slid to the shiny floor. He held his sleeve against the cut on his neck to stop the bleeding. Are you all right? Asked Eragon. Murtagh nodded jerkily. Did he get anything from you? No. How were you able to keep him out? He's so strong. I've been well trained. There was a bitter note to his voice. Silence enshrouded them. Eragon's gaze drifted to one of the lanterns hanging in a corner. His thoughts meandered until he abruptly said, I didn't let them know who you are. Murtagh looked relieved. He bowed his head. Thank you for not betraying me. They didn't recognize you. No. And you still say that you are Morzen's son? Yes, he sighed. Eragon started to speak, but stopped when he felt hot liquid splash onto his hand. He looked down and was startled to see a drop of dark blood roll off his skin. It had fallen from Saphira's wing. I forgot. You're injured, he exclaimed, getting up with an effort. I'd better heal you. Be careful. It's easy to make mistakes when you're this tired. I know. Saphira unfolded one of her wings and lowered it to the floor. Murtagh watched as Eragon ran his hands over the warm blue membrane, saying, Weiss, heal, whenever he found an arrow hole. Luckily, all the wounds were relatively easy to heal, even those on her nose. Task completed, Eragon slumped against Saphira, breathing hard. He could feel her great heart beating with a steady throb of life. I hope they bring food soon, said Murtagh. Eragon shrugged. He was too exhausted to be hungry. He crossed his arms, missing Zarok's weight by his side. Why are you here? What? If you were really Morzen's son, Galbatorix wouldn't let you wander around Allegatia freely. How is it that you managed to find the Razak by yourself? Why is it that I've never heard of any of the Forsworn having children? And what are you doing here? His voice rose to a near shout at the end. Murtagh ran his hands over his face. It's a long story. We're not going anywhere, rebutted Eragon. It's too late to talk. There probably won't be time for it tomorrow. Murtagh wrapped his arms around his legs and rested his chin on his knees, rocking back and forth as he stared at the floor. It's not a... he said, then interrupted himself. I don't want to stop, so make yourself comfortable. My story will take a while. Eragon shifted against Saphira's side and nodded. Saphira watched both of them intently. Murtag's first sentence was halting, but his voice gained strength and confidence as he spoke. As far as I know, I am the only child of the 13 servants, or the Forsworn, as they're called. There may be others, for the 13 had the skill to hide whatever they wanted, but I doubt it. For reasons I'll explain later. My parents met in a small village. I never learned where, while my father was travelling on the king's business. Morzan showed my mother some small kindness, no doubt a ploy to gain her confidence, and when he left, she accompanied him. They travelled together for a time, and as is the nature of these things, she fell deeply in love with him. Morzan was delighted to discover this, not only because it gave him numerous opportunities to torment her, but also because he recognised the advantage of having a servant who wouldn't betray him. Thus, when Morzan returned to Galbatorix's court, my mother became the tool he relied upon most. He used her to carry his secret messages, and he taught her rudimentary magic, which helped her remain undiscovered, and, on occasion, extract information from people. He did his best to protect her from the rest of the 13, not out of any feelings for her, but because they would have used her against him, given the chance. For 3 years things proceeded in this manner, until my mother became pregnant. Murtag paused for a moment, fingering a lock of his hair. He continued in a clipped tone. My father was, if nothing else, a cunning man. He knew that the pregnancy put both him and my mother in danger, not to mention the baby, that is, me. So, in the dead of night, he spirited her away from the palace and took her to his castle. Once there, he laid down powerful spells that prevented anyone from entering his estate except for a few chosen servants. In this way, the pregnancy was kept secret from everyone but Galbatorix. Galbatorix knew the intimate details of the 13's lives, their plots, their fights, and most importantly, their thoughts. He enjoyed watching them battle each other and often helped one or the other for his own amusement, but for some reason he never revealed my existence. I was born in due time and given to a wet nurse so my mother could return to Morzan's side. She had no choice in the matter. Morzan allowed her to visit me every few months, but otherwise we were kept apart. Another 3 years passed like this, during which time he gave me the scar on my back. Murtag brooded a minute before continuing. I would have grown to manhood in this fashion if Morzan hadn't been summoned away to hunt for Saphira's egg. As soon as he departed, my mother, who had been left behind, vanished. No one knows where she went or why. The king tried to hunt her down, but his men couldn't find her trail, no doubt because of Morzan's training. At the time of my birth, only 5 of the 13 were still alive. By the time Morzan left, that number had been reduced to 3. When he finally faced Brom in Gilead, he was the only one remaining. The Forsworn died through various means: suicide, ambush, overuse of magic. But it was mostly the work of the Varden. I'm told that the king was in a terrible rage because of those losses. However, before word of Morzan's and the others' deaths reached us, my mother returned. Many months had passed since she had disappeared. Her health was poor, as if she had suffered a great illness, and she grew steadily worse. Within a fortnight, she died. What happened then? Prompted Eragon. Murtag shrugged. I grew up. The king brought me to the palace and arranged for my upbringing. Aside from that, he left me alone. Then why did you leave? A hard laugh broke from Murtag. Escaped is more like it. At my last birthday, when I turned 18, the king summoned me to his quarters for a private dinner. The message surprised me, because I had always distanced myself from the court and had rarely met him. We'd talked before, but always within earshot of eavesdropping nobles. I accepted the offer, of course, aware that it would be unwise to refuse. The meal was sumptuous, but throughout it his black eyes never left me. His gaze was disconcerting. It seemed that he was searching for something hidden in my face. I didn't know what to make of it, and did my best to provide polite conversation, but he refused to talk, and I soon ceased my efforts. When the meal was finished, he finally began to speak. You've never heard his voice, so it's hard for me to make you understand what it was like. His words were entrancing, like a snake whispering gilded lies into my ears. A more convincing and frightening man I've never heard. He wove a vision, a fantasy of the Empire as he imagined it. There would be beautiful cities built across the country, filled with the greatest warriors, artisans, musicians, and philosophers. The Urgles would finally be eradicated, and the Empire would expand in every direction until it reached the 4 corners of Allegatia. Peace and prosperity would flourish. But more wondrous yet, the riders would be brought back to gently govern over Galbatorix's fiefdoms. Entranced, I listened to him for what must have been hours. When he stopped, I eagerly asked how the riders would be reinstated, for everyone knew there were no dragon eggs left. Galbatorix grew still then and stared at me thoughtfully. For a long time he was silent, but then he extended his hand and asked, "Will you, O son of my friend, serve me as I labour to bring about this paradise?" Though I knew the history behind his and my father's rise to power, the dream he had painted for me was too compelling, too seductive to ignore. Ardour for this mission filled me and I fervently pledged myself to him. Obviously pleased, Galbatorix gave me his blessing, then dismissed me, saying, "I shall call upon you when the need arises." Several months passed before he did. When the summons came, I felt all of my old excitement return. We met in private as before, but this time he was not pleasant or charming. The Varden had just destroyed 3 brigades in the south, and his wrath was out in full force. He charged me in a terrible voice to take a detachment of troops and destroy Cantos, where rebels were known to hide occasionally. When I asked what we should do with the people there and how we would know if they were guilty, he shouted, "They're all traitors! Burn them at the stake and bury their ashes with dung." He continued to rant, cursing his enemies and describing how he would scourge the land of everyone who bore him ill will. His tone was so different from what I had encountered before. Made me realise he didn't possess the mercy or foresight to gain the people's loyalty, and he ruled only through brute force guided by his own passions. It was at that moment I determined to escape him and Urubain forever. As soon as I was free of his presence, I and my faithful servant, Tornak, made ready for flight. We left that very night, but somehow Galbatorix anticipated my actions, for there were soldiers waiting for us outside the gates. My sword was bloody, flashing in the dim lantern glow. We defeated the men, but in the process, Tornak was killed. Alone and filled with grief, I fled to an old friend who sheltered me in his estate. While I hid, I listened carefully to every rumour, trying to predict Galbatorix's actions and plan my future. During that time, talk reached me that the Razak had been sent to capture or kill someone. Remembering the king's plans for the riders, I decided to find and follow the Razak, just in case they did discover a dragon. And that's how I found you. I have no more secrets. "We still don't know if he's telling the truth," warned Saphira. "I know," said Eragon, "but why would he lie to us? He might be mad." "I doubt it." Eragon ran a finger over Saphira's hard scales, watching the light reflect off them. "So why don't you join the Varden? They'll distrust you for a time, but once you prove your loyalty, they'll treat you with respect. And aren't they in a sense your allies? They strive to end the king's reign. Isn't that what you want?" "Must I spell everything out for you?" demanded Murtagh. "I don't want Galbatorix to learn where I am, which is inevitable if people start saying that I've sided with his enemies, which I've never done. These," he paused, then said with distaste, "rebels are trying not to only overthrow the king but to destroy the empire. And I don't want that to happen. It would sow mayhem and anarchy. The king is flawed, yes, but the system itself is sound. As for earning the Varden's respect, ha! Once I'm exposed, they'll treat me like a criminal or worse. Not only that, suspicion will fall upon you because we travel together." "He's right," said Saphira. Eragon ignored her. "It isn't that bad," he said, trying to sound optimistic. Murtagh snorted derisively and looked away. "I'm sure that they won't be." His words were cut short as the door opened a hand's breadth and 2 bowls were pushed through the space. A loaf of bread and a hunk of raw meat followed. Then the door was shut again. "Finally," grumbled Murtagh, going to the food. He tossed the meat to Saphira, who snapped it up out of the air and swallowed it whole. Then he tore the loaf in 2, gave half to Eragon, picked up his bowl and retreated to a corner. They ate silently. Murtagh jabbed at his food. "I'm going to sleep," he announced, putting down his bowl without another word. "Good night," said Eragon. He lay next to Saphira, his arms under his head. She curled her long neck around him, like a cat wrapping its tail around itself, and laid her head alongside his. One of her wings extended over him like a blue tent, enveloping him in darkness. "Good night, little one." A small smile lifted Eragon's lips, but he was already asleep.